Oh, good evening.
Good evening. How are you?
You look so familiar. Where did I see you?
It's been a while. Oh, we've set up something new.
He wants to stand.
Otherwise, I'm going to fall asleep.
Oh, I have the Stender downstairs.
What Stender? What Stender? I have a Stender? Gallon Stender's downstairs?
Used to be, I don't know if it took down.
Since when?
Used to be.
Yeah, like 15 years ago.
Where's your crowd?
You don't see it?
Yeah, where's the crowd?
You were sitting here.
Fire department, so it's a fire.
There was a traffic jam with all the cars trying to park here.
The kids for us. Not the smart as you see.
What time is it now?
Another
Are we on already?
I think it's out
Oh, so.
29, one moment. Oh, look at this way, man.
Sure. The jitters before the show.
I'm not used to the crowds. Ready? Is this light another way? Oh, I can't read the notes.
Oh,
Stender isn't very
isn't this one?
Yeah?
Yeah,
Okay, are we ready?
Yep.
Good evening, and welcome to our continuing series on the Shemona Esrei, the central prayer of Judaism. And we're up to the 10th blessing. Just to give a brief introduction where we're up to and how the prayer flows. The prayer is divided into three sections. The first section, we devote 3 blessings to praising God. Because before we make a petition, we ask something of God, we first have to praise Him. It sounds like, almost human-like, that before you want to get a favor from someone, you have to first make them want to give you something. So you praise them, you shmear them. How can you say that about God? But the truth is that when we praise God, that's how we take those potential energies that God has and we actualize them, because that's really what prayer is all about, is to take the potential energy that God might have reserved for us and to bring it into our own lives. So the process of praise, just like human beings, when you praise someone, they have a quality, but it isn't being used, it's not being actualized. The praise can help to actualize it. The word in Hebrew for praise is hilul or hallel, which also has the connotation of light. Light is property that takes something that is concealed, you don't see it, you shed light on it, you reveal it, you actualize it, you make people become aware of what it is. So after we've praised God, and on a very simple level, we have a greater awareness of God. So when we ask God for something, we're much more respectful. And then on a deeper level, we're able to actualize the hidden energies that God has. We then ask God for the things that we need, and we start off with asking God for wisdom or knowledge. That's the first of the requests. As I mentioned in previous classes, there are 3 introductory prayers or blessings where we praise God. And at the end of the Amidah, there's the 3 concluding blessings in which we express our gratitude of God. And in between, if we have a total of 18, but really there's 19, because one was added on, so in between those 6, you have another 13 blessings. Of those 13, they are also divided into 2 sections. The first 6 are requests that relate to the individual as an individual. The next 6 relate to the people, as a nation. They're communal requests. The 13th one, Shema Kolenu, we ask God to listen to our voice, is a broad general one that encompasses all of the 12 that preceded it. So we already concluded the first 6 personal requests, and now we're up to the first of the 6 national or communal requests. So it's the 10th blessing, starting from the beginning, but it's also the first of a series of 6, in which we ask God for freedom, which, as Americans, we realize how important that term is. Freedom has become a very central term in American history. And of course, it's based on the concept of freedom, which Judaism always promoted. But when we ask God for freedom, we're asking for real freedom. Freedom in all senses of the word, and we'll get more into the definition of freedom as we go on. But we're asking God not just for freedom in this blessing, in this prayer, we're also asking God for reunification. At the simple level, it means that all of the Jewish people should be reunited. And we'll get into that as we go on as well. Maimonides, when he discusses the laws of prayer, establishes the premise that the Shemona Esrei, this prayer that we're studying, contains within it all of the needs of the people as individuals and as a people, as a nation. These are the most important needs. What is the most important need that human beings need, based on the fact that this is the first communal blessing? It is redemption, freedom, true liberation. That is the ultimate request, because it is our greatest need. And that itself begs for some clarification. Yes, freedom, everyone recognizes, is important. Being a slave is not a positive thing, to put it mildly. And we do everything in our power to rail against any form of illegal servitude that we impose on people. But why is this the greatest and the ultimate need? Isn't life? Well, one could argue that yes, after you're alive, the next most important thing is to be free. But when we're talking here about freedom, we're talking about freedom in a much broader sense. One could be a slave physically, and they could be a free person spiritually. One could be enslaved to a human master, but as long as they have freedom in terms of their relationship with their ultimate master, they are more free than the person who is the master of the slave. The slave could be more free than the master. So we're talking about the real freedom, freedom that represents true spiritual freedom, and it's freedom that also is broad because it encompasses the whole world. And we'll get into that a little more as we go on as well. Let's first understand what exactly we're asking for in this blessing, because we already had a blessing. The seventh blessing was God should see our suffering and redeem us. That was already about redemption, about freedom. So why are we asking for the same thing again? And I found three different answers to this question that distinguish between the seventh blessing and the 10th. Number one, in the seventh blessing, we're talking about freedom within the parameters of exile. We're not asking for the messianic redemption. We're asking, as we live in exile, as we live in the diaspora, as we live in the pre-redemption era, we want God to redeem us, to give us freedom, not to be subjected to any type of persecution, any type of oppression. The 10th blessing, on the other hand, is for the ultimate redemption, ultimate freedom. Not just relative freedom, but the ultimate freedom. So that's one difference. The second difference, some commentators point out, is that the seventh blessing is primarily about the freedom of the body, the physical freedom. We should not be afflicted with anything that harms us physically and oppresses us physically, whereas the 10th blessing is about spiritual freedom. Now, in truth, they go together. Physical freedom, and it helps us be free spiritually, and spiritual freedom helps us physically. But the focus of the seventh one is the physical freedom, and the spiritual comes along with it, tags along with it. The 10th blessing, the focus is on spiritual freedom, and the physical freedom tags along with it. And finally, a third difference is that this is reflected in the differences between the first 6 requests and the second group of 6 requests, that the first group of 6 requests deals with personal freedom as an individual. Even if we talk about freedom and we ask God to redeem us, using the plural, we're talking primarily about us as individuals, and we want to share our freedom with others. The 10th blessing, on the other hand, is a request for collective freedom, freedom of the nation, freedom of the entire world. And all these three differences go together, really, because the ultimate redemption is one that will be comprehensive. It'll encompass everyone. It's not just the body, but it's also the soul. There'll be a total spiritual revolution and redemption. And it's the ultimate future redemption, not just freedom in exile. So all these three differences really revolve around one point. So we now know that this blessing is a request for freedom. Please come in. There's still some room here. It's a request for freedom, but for the ultimate redemption, not just some temporary respite from suffering and pain, not just a localized area of redemption, not just the physical, but it's the physical and the spiritual for everyone permanently. That's what this blessing is about. And that's why it's the most important request that we can have, because all other requests in which we ask God for something, we know that that something is temporary. Someone asks God for good health. Well, good health doesn't last forever. It lasts only as long as a person is going to live. A person asks God for prosperity. It's only as long as a person is alive. And you can be rich one period of your life, and then, God forbid, a person could lose the wealth. But when we ask for the future redemption, that is not only going to be a much more comprehensive and much more profound redemption, it's permanent. There is no going back. It's the ultimate, it'll solve all the problems in the world. Okay, now, as we did in preceding classes, we tried to show how each blessing is connected to the one before. They're not just thrown in there haphazardly. We asked God in the ninth blessing for blessing the year, blessing our crops, giving us sustenance. How does this follow from that one? Well, the Talmud asks the question and answers that there's a verse in Ezekiel, you have it in the notes, it's in Ezekiel chapter 36, verse 8, but ye, O mountains of Israel, yea, shall shoot forth your branches and yield your fruit to my people Israel, for they are at hand to come. It links the ability to have produce, the shoot forth your branches and yield your fruit, but it talks about my people Israel who are at hand to come. So it links the Jewish people returning to Israel with the crops being successful. So the Talmud understands that when we ask God for prosperity, that's followed immediately by saying, you want to really have prosperity? You really want the land to produce? You need the Jewish people to return to Israel, which is one of the features of the ultimate future redemption. It's not just a redemption wherever we are, any part of the world, but the Jews will be reunited and brought back to the land of Israel. And it's interesting historically that Israel, the land, was never able to flourish without Jews inhabiting the land. When Jews lived in the land, it was a land of milk and honey. When Jews lived in Israel, it was an incredibly fertile and uh, beautiful place. When Jews were exiled from it, it became a wasteland, a desert. Not until Jews returned in the last century did Israel become a place that's one of the leaders in agriculture. It's an incredible fact of history. One cannot deny it. No one was able to colonize Israel because Israel was a wasteland. Maimonides, when he fled Morocco, in I think the year about 1180, approximately around that time, he went to Israel. And he didn't stay there very long. And he writes about his journey to Israel, how horrible the place was, physically, not spiritually, but physically. The place was overrun by marauding bandits. There were hardly any Jews there. It was a wasteland. It was desolate. It was a horrible, horrible place. And he had to leave there. And they settled in Egypt. And this is the story of Israel. Whenever Jews were not there, Israel could not flourish. But that's these two blessings go together. You want the land to flourish, you have to have Jews in Israel. But it goes beyond that. The Talmud says that when God blesses the world with rain and produce, he blesses Israel first, and through Israel, the blessing is channeled to the rest of the world. Israel is the center of the world in terms of the prosperity. So when we ask God for prosperity, we follow it immediately by make Israel strong. And how does Israel become strong? Israel, the land, only when it's connected to Israel, the people. This is the 10th blessing. We always try to point out the significance of the number in relation to the request of this particular blessing. Number 1, this blessing focuses on Israel, focuses on redemption, but also the return of the Jewish people, the ingathering of the exiles, and returning the Jews to the land of Israel. The land of Israel is connected to the number 10. In the Mishnah, it talks about the holiness of the land of Israel, and it says there are 10 degrees of holiness in Israel. You go from the cities that had walls around it, and then Jerusalem was holier. Then in Jerusalem itself, you have the Temple Mount. In the Temple Mount, you had the courtyard of the temple, and there were several different sections until you got to the Holy of Holies. So there's a total of 10 levels of holiness in Israel. So that's one connection, that Israel is connected to the number 10. 10 in general is considered to be a symbol of holiness. The Torah says when a person had animals in Israel, he would count his animals, and the 10th one he would have to designate as holy and bring it to Jerusalem as a sacrifice. The 10th is holy. And without going into the Kabbalah, number 10 is considered to be a very special number in holiness, and that's why Israel, the request for Israel, is associated with the number 10. But we know that 10, of course, is a minyan. You have 10 adult males, you have a minyan. It's interesting that even those who try to compromise in Jewish law and include people who are not men in a minyan, give you a few guesses what kind of people those could be who are not men, are not willing to compromise on the number 10. That's interesting. If you have a problem with a minyan, why do you look to count people who were traditionally and halachically not counted? Change the number from 10 to 7 or 6 or whatever number you need. Well, somehow this is ingrained. I'm saying this as not as a criticism. I'm saying this as a praise, that there are certain things that even when a Jew tries to change and modify their religion, certain things remain so sacrosanct, they can't change that. No, I'll do everything to change my values, but I'm never going to change the number 10 from a minyan. So there's something about the number 10 that is ingrained in us, that we need 10 for the minyan. But it's interesting and it's fascinating that when was this blessing first recited? I mentioned this and all the other blessings, that an angel recited all these blessings at different points in the early history of the Jewish people. When did the angel say these words that God gathers in the exiles? When Jacob traveled to Egypt and was reunited with his family. And now there was a reunion of how many sons of Jacob? Of 10. Why 10? Because Joseph was the victim. So we're not counting him. Reuven wanted to save Joseph's life. When the brothers sold him, he wasn't there, so we don't count him. Benjamin was not among them. He was too young and he was not involved. He wouldn't have sold his brother. So there were really 9. Joseph, we're taking out Joseph, Reuven, and Benjamin. You have 9 brothers that were in a fight with Joseph. And when there was this reunion, the 9 brothers and Jacob, or the 9 brothers and Joseph, was probably more the reunification of the 10 brothers. That's when the angel said, "Blessed is God who brings the Jewish people together." As we conclude in the blessing, the Kabetz Nidchei Ama Yisrael, who gathers together those Jews who are cast away, who are sent away. That was the first time you had a minyan, a real minyan, Jewish unity. So this blessing is about Jewish unity, and the first time you had a minyan that really made a difference was then when Jacob came to Egypt. A minyan is 10 Jews. There's a story, the 3rd Lubavitcher Rebbe had a son, 7 sons, but one of them's name was Yosef Yitzchak. He was a grandfather of the previous Lubavitcher Rebbe, whose name after him, Yosef Yitzchak. Now this Yosef Yitzchak was married to a woman whose father was another Hasidic Rebbe from a non-Chabad background, Polish background. His name was Rabbi Yaakov Yisrael Cherkasser. There's a Rebbe buried in Buffalo, who many people go to, who was a brother-in-law, a son-in-law of this Rabbi Yisrael Cherkasser. So a brother-in-law of this Rebbe Yosef Yitzchak. Now, in Chabad, people who were steeped in the teachings of Hasidus would recite their prayers for hours and hours, deep meditation and introspection, and they wouldn't pray with a minyan, with 10 Jews, because no minyan is going to last for 5 hours. In the Polish Hasidic traditions, they were very careful to daven, to pray with a minyan, with 10 Jews. So when this Rabbi Yosef Yitzchak got married and he lived with his father-in-law, there was a little bit of tension there, because Shabbos afternoon, when everyone was sitting at the Shabbos table and enjoying the Kiddush, the son-in-law, the Chabad son-in-law, was still praying for hours and hours. And the father-in-law was a little bit upset because that was not his tradition. So he calls in his son-in-law one day and he says, I want you to pray with a minyan. Will you promise me that next Shabbos you will pray with a minyan? He says, yes, I will. Next Shabbos comes and they're sitting at the Kiddush. Where is Yosef Yitzchak? Where is he? And they go to the shul. They see he's barely at the beginning of the davening, and they went down for another few hours. His father-in-law was upset, so he calls him in after Shabbos, and he says to him, you promised me that you will daven with a minyan. And he says, yes, I did. He says, well, what happened? He says, what is a minyan? A minyan, we have 10 faculties of our soul. And the 10 faculties are in all different directions. Your mind is one place. Your heart is in another place. This part of your mind is in this subject. This emotion is here. That emotion is there. You can't pray like that. You have to bring all your emotions together, all your faculties together in one place. He says, it takes me time to do that. So I tried to daven with a minyan, but I couldn't get all the 10 faculties together. What do you do if there's no 10 people in the room? You have to wait until you get everyone in the room. He says, well, my minyan was taking time to get together. So what exactly is a minyan? It's bringing together all your 10 faculties. And that's what this 10th blessing is about. How do we bring the redemption, the reunification of the Jewish people, bringing together all of the different, disparate entities within the Jewish community? It starts with our own personal minyan. You get your own minyan together. You coordinate your mind and your heart, for starters, and all of your faculties are coordinated. That's the spiritual equivalent of God gathering Jews from all parts of the world and bringing them into Israel. It's bringing all your faculties into the spiritual Israel of your soul. Another thing about the number 10 then. 10 is the perfect number. People say, well, that's only true in our system of counting. After 10, 11 is 10 plus 1, and 20 is 2 times 10. But in Judaism, it's also that way. The Kabbalists say, I think it's the Ibn Ezra who's the first one who says this openly, and then the Ramak, the great Kabbalist of Moshe Cordovero, point out that there is no number above 10. 10 is the ultimate number. 11 is just 10 plus 1. 20 is a multiple of 10. But 10 there's no more than that. And it's based on the Kabbalistic notion that God has 10 attributes, from which our soul possesses 10 faculties. So everything in this world is a composite of 10 plus something else. So when you use the number 10, in English, 10 represents, on a scale of 1 to 10, people will say, well, what does that mean, a scale of 1 to 10? 10 meaning the top. You can't have more than 10. There's no point in saying more than 10. Or a person says 100%. What is 100%? Everything, totality. It can't be more than 100%. I know people say it's 1,000%. It's redundant to say 1,000%. If it's 100%, it's everything. What is 100? 10 times 10. It's the ultimate 10. So when you say the number 10, you're talking about completion, perfection. And that's what this blessing is about. This is why it's such an important blessing. You're saying to God, God, we're living in an imperfect world. We're living in a flawed world. We're living in a world of fragmentation. We're living in a world where we're missing important ingredients in our lives as individuals and as a people. Restore the integrity of your world by restoring the integrity of the Jewish people, restoring the integrity of the land of Israel, because Israel without its people is not a land. It's called Eretz Yisrael. Which came first, Israel or the land? Israel came first. Israel was Jacob, and his descendants settled there and became the land of Israel. Without the Jewish people there, Israel is incomplete. Without the land of Israel, the Jewish people are incomplete. Because that's the land that we belong to, and that's the land that unites us. And without Israel, the people, and without Israel, the land, the Torah is incomplete. We cannot observe many of the commandments of the Torah today simply because we don't have the Jewish people living in Israel. Even if we had the temple built, there are still mitzvahs that we cannot do without the majority of the Jews living in Israel. Majority of Jews meaning from all different tribes. So 10 represents perfection, completion. So this is the blessing, the 10th blessing, in which we ask God, God, give us perfection. We're tired of compromised existence. We're tired of half-baked solutions. We're tired of, well, relatively speaking, we're better off than we used to be. That's true. And unfortunately, we are all relativists. Our whole life is about, relative to something else, how are we doing? I guarantee you, if everyone in America who is now poor, is under the poverty level, will make $10 million. Can live on $10 million a year? I think so. But the people who are now billionaires will be making 1,000 times more, will become trillionaires. The $10 million people will still feel poor. They'll still be saying, we're poor, we have to have more. Why? Because everything is relative. That's a flaw in our way of thinking. Our way of thinking is so flawed because we cannot think in terms of absolutes. This is good. No, it's good if it's compared to something else that's less than it. So we're living, and there's so many other ways that our lives are incomplete. The world is incomplete. And it starts off with the Torah, the Jewish people in the land of Israel. So this blessing is a 10. Make our lives complete. But let's get into the actual text of the blessing. Sound the great shofar. This is, of course, addressed to God, in which we say, sound the great shofar. What is the shofar referring to? Shofar is an instrument. What kind of an instrument is it? It has very poor musical sounds to it. Very few Philharmonics have the shofar as one of their main instruments. It's not known for its beautiful sounds. It's not intended as a musical instrument. The shofar is intended, when we blow the shofar, it takes a lot of energy to blow the shofar, but the shofar is supposed to symbolize the simple, pristine, innermost sound that comes from the depths of your soul. It's like coming to God from the depths of your soul and crying out to Him. That's what the shofar is in Rosh Hashanah. So when we ask God to sound His shofar, what are we asking God to do? We're asking God, God, we're tired of you expressing yourself from the external aspect of your being. We want it to come from within you. We want your innermost feelings for us to be revealed. And if you use an analogy, it's like the analogy between a parent and a employer or a teacher who's not a parent. They deal with people in a nice way, but if you don't do the right things, the teacher will expel you from the class. The employer will fire you. A parent cannot expel a child or fire a child. There's an inner connection between the parent and the child. So when they talk about God blowing the shofar, we're asking God, express your innermost relationship with us, not just the external, peripheral ways that you deal with us, the way a teacher would, the way a master would, the way an employer would, but deal with us from the depths of your, quote unquote, heart and soul. That's addressing God. In the biblical text, in the book of Isaiah, it talks about, is it Isaiah or Jeremiah? That the day will come that a great shofar will sound, and those who are lost in the land of Ashur, Assyria, will come. Those who are cast away in the land of Egypt, they will all come to Jerusalem. That's more or less the biblical text, and that's what this is modeled after. That a day will come that this great shofar will sound. Now, when do we sound the shofar? Of course, Rosh Hashanah. We also sound the shofar at the end of Yom Kippur. But in the Torah, we find that the shofar is sounded on the Jubilee year. In Israel, You had 7 cycles of sabbaticals, and the 50th year is called Yovel, the Jubilee year, and they would sound the shofar on Yom Kippur, actually, the way we do on Rosh Hashanah, and the servants would go free. Indentured servants would go free. You should declare freedom in all the land. The words that are enshrined on the Liberty Bell in Philadelphia are taken from that biblical verse. Most people don't know, what does the word Jubilee mean? Jubilee comes from the Hebrew, Yovel. It's one of the English words that are obviously taken from the Hebrew directly. What does the word Yovel mean? Yovel means a sheep, a ram. Why is the year called a sheep? Because they blow the shofar, which comes from a ram's horn. So the year of freedom is associated with the shofar. Jubilee means the shofar that is sounded to declare freedom. Why is the shofar a symbol of freedom? Why is it a symbol of freedom? What does the sound of a shofar have to do with freedom? What does the instrument have to do with freedom? Well, perhaps one explanation is the shofar, when you blow in the shofar, the mouthpiece is narrow. The sound comes out from a wider piece at the end. Try doing it the other way around. It's not going to work. You have to blow the narrow side of the shofar, and the sound comes out of the wider side. Well, the Talmud says that that's based on a verse in Psalms, Min HaMeitzar, from the straits, Karasi Ka, I call out to you, God, Anani Bamerchav, respond to me in a broad manner. And the Talmud says when you start the year humbled and in distress, and you pour out your heart to God, that's Meitzar, that's narrow. What comes out at the end is an expansive, broad, and prosperous year. So the whole idea of the shofar is crying out from the depths. As King David also says in Psalms, Mimamakim, from the depths I call out to God. If someone comes to God, standing before God, and says, God, you know who I am? Yeah, I'm very special. I want this and I want that. God says, who do you think you are? We call out to God from the straits, and then God answers us in a very rich and positive and expansive manner. So that's the idea of the shofar. The shofar is a person is in distress. He's not free. He's enslaved. And the shofar symbolizes breaking out of that state of enslavement. A shofar is also known for its ability to awaken someone. The biblical verse says, if a shofar will sound in a city, will the people not tremble? It wakes you up. Maimonides, when he talks about Rosh Hashanah, the shofar of Rosh Hashanah, says one of the reasons for sounding the shofar is to awaken us, because we might be asleep spiritually and we have to be awakened. We have to be awakened to change our ways, to mend our ways. So when God wants to bring the redemption, he sounds the shofar, because what that means, in order to be worthy of redemption, he wants us to change. He wants us to return to God. So he sounds the shofar that awakens us and stimulates us. Sometimes the shofar can be very painful, a painful reminder. Sometimes the shofar could be a very happy occasion, but it's a jolting one. It's a very powerful one. But then the question is, what's the difference between a shofar and a great shofar? Why is it called the great shofar? The Midrash says that when Abraham brought Isaac as a sacrifice, then God said, no, I didn't mean that. It was a ram that he took, and he sacrificed the ram. Well, rams have 2 horns. The left horn was used by God to give the Torah at Mount Sinai. It says the shofar sounded and they trembled. That was the left horn of the ram that was used as an offering in place of Isaac. What happened with the right horn? That was reserved for the future. That's what God will use to usher in the messianic redemption. The right horn was larger than the left one. And that's a metaphor as well. The giving of the Torah, as powerful as that event was, the world didn't really change very much at that point. It was the beginning. It's the Torah that gave the world its ability to develop and mature and transform itself. But the final shofar sounding is the great shofar. That great shofar will really change the world permanently. That's why it's the great shofar. Rabbi Kook, the famous first chief rabbi of Israel, who was known for his very strong Zionist views, and sometimes people associated him with, he was too lenient in relation to Jews who were not observant, and that he didn't really care that much as long as they were Zionists. Well, that's not quite true. He said that there are many reasons why people return to Israel. There are many people in whom the shofar sounded. Some people return to Israel because they have this Zionist notion of national identity. Some people return to Israel, and I'm embellishing some of his words, because of their socialist agenda, that they felt this would be a utopia for people, for Jews living in a socialist country. Some return to Israel because they're escaping persecution. That's not the shofar that the prayer is talking about. This is the great shofar. This is the shofar that tells you you're returning to Israel because that's where God says the Jew belongs. That's where God's presence is revealed most strongly. That's where God says we should ultimately connect to. And that's where the temple would be built. And that's the shofar gadol. The great shofar, the greatest motivation is the spiritual motivation for Israel, not the other secondary or tertiary reasons. The Rebbe pointed out something extremely powerful. The prophets talk about the shofar. There's one verse which talks about the shofar. Another verse talks about the great shofar. The Rebbe said those events already transpired. We already heard those two. The Holocaust was a wake-up call for the Jewish people. It stirred the Jewish people. It shook them up. It jolted them. But what really jolted the Jewish people was the Six-Day War. I remember it distinctly as a student, how Jews were of every stripe, were like so stimulated and aroused, as if this is the ultimate, who knows what will happen to Israel. In Tel Aviv, they dug 15,000 graves, expecting there to be that many civilian casualties in the Six-Day War, because the Arabs were planning to overrun Israel and drive them into the sea, literally. And who knows what could have happened. Israel was outnumbered. And that whole event, and especially the miracles that happened, and the lightning-quick victory, was the shofar gadol, the great shofar that awakened the Jewish people. And the Rebbe was begging rabbis and Jewish leaders not to squander that opportunity, but to harness it immediately to Jewish action. Not just to say, God, great, it's great, look at the miracles you did. But to say, God, you did great miracles, I'm going to start putting on tefillin, I'm going to start keeping Shabbos, I'm going to start doing another mitzvah, I'm going to learn Torah, whatever else is Jewish. And that great shofar, I think, is still being sounded. We just have to try to hear it. Okay, then we say we're asking God for our freedom. What is the definition of freedom? We already touched on that briefly. We'll try to talk about freedom a little bit more in detail. What is real freedom? Freedom is not being a slave. That's not the definition of freedom. That's the definition of not being a slave. Freedom is a positive concept, not a negative one. Wealth is not the absence of poverty. Light is not the absence of darkness. Darkness is the absence of light, but light is not the absence of darkness. Sobriety is not the absence of intoxication. Someone once said that, what is the definition of sobriety? Deficiency of alcohol in your blood. That's it's a disease. No, sobriety is not the absence of something else. Light is not the absence of darkness. Freedom is not the absence of slavery. You could be a non-slave, because most people in the world are not slaves today, thank God. And that's not a small thing. That's a major change in society today. But that's not the definition of freedom. Freedom means that you are in total sync with your true inner desires and needs. And the inner desires and needs are defined not by what the conscious mind thinks is right, but what your soul, which is your true identity, desires and needs. So if my body wants one thing, my soul wants something else, and I allow my body to have the freedom to let my body do whatever it wants, I'm not free. I'm even more enslaved, because that way my soul is getting further away from fulfilling its desires. So true freedom is not an external freedom where no one is enslaving you, but it's doing what you really are all about and living in consonance with your true inner desires, which is your soul's desires. And your soul's desires are bound up with, of course, God. But it helps to be free externally and physically as well. Question is, which comes first? Do you want to ask God for external freedom? Yes, we sometimes say to God, God, my life is very difficult physically. If I'd be healthier, if I would have more money, if I would be more free, I'd have more time, I'd be able to study more Torah, I'd be able to do mitzvahs better, I'd be able to give more tzedakah. So God, I need you to take away my physical impairment so that I could be more spiritually free. It works. That works. It's a good thing to ask God. But sometimes God says, I'm waiting for you to be free spiritually before you can be free physically. So it goes in both directions. But we always have to remember that true freedom is when the spiritual part of you is free, and the ultimate freedom is when the two go in tandem. When the physical and the spiritual are mirror reflections of one another. That's one of the features of the Messianic age, because we always had periods in history when we were free spiritually. The Jew in the Soviet Union who couldn't practice Judaism because he was a slave of the Soviet regime and in danger of being caught, still was free inside. He knew what his soul wanted, but he wasn't free physically. He couldn't express it physically, externally. Then the Jew who was able to be free externally in America but doesn't even know what the soul wants. The ultimate goal is for both freedoms to coalesce. And the current state of affairs is that most people are not really free because they don't really know what their soul wants. And if they know what their soul wants and they don't live that way, then they certainly are not free. Then we ask God, raise a banner to gather in our dispersed exiles. What is the definition of exile? Exile literally means you're not where you belong. You're not at home. There are two forms of alienation, of being alienated from your home. One is represented by the symbol of the Assyrian Empire. They were the first empire to conquer Israel, and they sent the 10 tribes into captivity, into exile. That's when we get the term 10 lost tribes. But the word Assyria in Hebrew, Ashur, is related to a word in Hebrew that means prosperity, good fortune. There are Jews who are lost to Judaism because of their good fortune and the prosperity, the assimilation process. Because they are so much into the material world, they lose sight of the spiritual. And then there is the other symbol of the Jews who are cast away in Egypt. Egypt is Mitzrayim, which we discussed many times, comes from a root that means straits, in distress. They're physically constrained. The Soviet Union was a combination of both. Many periods in history, Jews were suffering physically and suffering spiritually, and some one or the other. So when we talk about bringing together our exiles, our dispersed exiles, we're talking about both forms of exile. The Jew who is not free, and the Jew who is not free physically, and the Jew who is not free spiritually. According to one commentary, this request to gather in our dispersed exiles refers specifically for the 10 lost tribes. In the Talmud, there's a dispute if the 10 lost tribes are ever coming back. And one opinion says, no, they're lost. They're lost for posterity. And the other opinion, which this prayer reflects, no, they will come back. The Jewish people will always get back their lost ones. No Jew is ever lost forever. Even if they're lost in this period of history, the Jew will eventually come back. No Jew could be lost. But it's interesting, in this prayer, there are two different requests. We're asking God to sound the shofar, the audio, and then to raise the banner, which is the visual. So we have audio-visual here in this blessing. Why do we need both forms of audio and visual? So the first thing that came to mind before I looked into it and found another commentary that talks about it was, if you're asleep, no visual stimuli will help you. You're asleep, your eyes are closed. For the person who's asleep, they need audio. They have to hear the shofar. You hear the sound of the shofar, that'll wake you up. You know the story, I told it 100 times, of this Jew who moves to Israel and he takes residence in a kibbutz, and everyone shares everything. And he didn't have a watch, so when he would need to tell time, he would go over to someone and say, excuse me, can you tell me what time it is? And after a few weeks, people were getting sick and tired of having to tell him time, so they buy him a gift for his birthday, a gift-wrapped watch. And he opens it up and he looks at it. He says, what do I need this for? And they say, well, it's to tell time. He says, what do I need it for? I can ask you any time of the day. He says, well, what do you do in the middle of the night if you want to know what time it is and there's no one around to ask? He says, I use a shofar. Yeah, how do you get the time from a shofar? He says, I open the window and I start blowing, and within seconds I'm getting people saying, it's 2 in the morning, it's 3 in the morning, what are you doing? So the shofar is intended to get you awake, to awaken you, even if you're in a deep sleep. So there are some Jews who are so deeply engrossed in their sleep that they are not capable of seeing what's going on in the world. I mean, if you look around the world, you see so many different miracles and so many different signs that we're living in momentous times and that God is in control of this world. But if you're sleeping, you need to hear the shofar, the sound of the shofar. For those who are awake and are more able to see what's going on, God is raising the banner and showing us. The Hebrew word for banner is nes. Nes. Nes also has two other meanings. Nes means miracle, and nes means raised up, exalted. And they're all related because a banner is usually something you put high up. And miracle is something that is higher above nature. But nes means it's uplifted. So all three meanings are really related. And what is this trying to say? That you should raise a banner that when you look at the things that are happening that are not normal, that are not natural, there are so many miracles that if we just open our eyes to look at them, that would change us. The Rebbe, in fact, in his last talks, would say that everything is ready for the redemption. The redemption is in front of us. We just have to open our eyes. So we're past the age when we need to be jolted. We've been jolted enough. Now we just have to open our eyes. We have our eyes open, but we're not looking. Just have to look because it's right in front of us. You could see the nes. And the Rebbe then refers specifically to the collapse of the Soviet Union and the Gulf War, where incredible miracles were happening. Then I found this commentary, Meshech Chochmah, who said the opposite of what I just said. He says the audio is for those who can detect an inner voice. They can hear the inner voice. They can hear the shofar, because the shofar, he says, is not external, it's internal. But to hear the internal sound of the shofar, you have to be much more receptive than to hear the external shofar, obviously. Anyone can hear someone blasting a trumpet or any other instrument. But the internal shofar, you have to be more receptive. And this is what he's saying is consistent with something the Baal Shem Tov once said. It says in the Talmud that every day there's a heavenly voice that emerges from Mount Sinai and exhorts us to change our ways. He says, what's the point of that heavenly voice, Baal Shem Tov asked, if we don't hear it? And the people who we assume are so sensitive spiritually, they do hear it, don't need it. They're in good shape the way they are. So what is the point of this heavenly voice? And the Baal Shem Tov says we do hear it subconsciously. Our soul hears it and relays it to our bodies or to our conscious mind. And the way we react to it is we feel uncomfortable about something. We feel, I have to change. It might be a fleeting moment of things are not right. I want to become a better Jew. And then 2 minutes later, you forget about it. That's when the heavenly voice has emerged. And most of the time, we don't even notice it. We don't even hear that inner voice that's telling us. That voice from Sinai is an inner voice, the inner shofar. For those people who can't hear it, they have to see it in front of them. Seeing is believing. When you see something, then even if you don't hear it, the inner voice, so we can take this in both directions. That there are certain people could hear but not see. Some people could see and not hear. Then we say, gather us together from the four corners of the earth to our land. The ultimate is not just being free. The ultimate is being reunited. Because a Jew is not free until they are all united together. Where? In the land of Israel. Actually, in some prayer books, Nusach Ashkenaz, it doesn't have the word to our land, Li'artzenu. This is in the Chabad version. It has to our land. But even the ones who don't have it, it's implied that we're talking about gathering us not in Buffalo or in New York or in Paris. It's gathering all Jews together in where Jews belong, in Israel. That's the final stage of the redemptive process. Why is the land of Israel so important? Because you're not free until you are together with all the other Jewish people. Jews, it's like a human body. If, God forbid, a part of your body is separated from the rest of the body, you can't say, I'm in good health. You need all your organs together. And even if they're together physically, but they're not working as a unit, parts of your body are disconnected, there's a blockage, then you're not a healthy person either. Same thing is true with the state of the Jewish people. Our health, our freedom depends on our connection to every other Jew. Where can Jews be really connected? Only in Israel. So we are now scattered all over the world, physically. Even if we'd all gather together, we'd have a convention, and every Jew shows up at some central site somewhere in South America, wherever it is, that would be great. That would be a sign of unity, but it would only be an external unity. Where do you have really internal unity? When all Jews are together in the land of Israel, which will happen in the final stage of the Messianic age. As I mentioned before, return to the land of Israel restores the integrity of the Torah as well, because the Torah cannot be practiced in its entirety as long as the majority of Jews do not live in Israel. So when we ask God to take us back to Israel, it's not just asking for our integrity, our freedom, but it's also the completion of the Torah, without which, again, we're defective. Together, what does that mean? Gather us together. So together, some say, means together with you, God. We're not going back without you. You have to return with us. because God is in exile when we're in exile, and when we go back, God goes back with us. And together means that we're going together not just as one people, but one people with one belief system, one people with one purpose, one people with one goal. That's the ultimate. That happened once in all of Jewish history, that all Jews should be united, that we all agreed on something. It happened when the Jews were standing at the foot of Mount Sinai. The Torah uses the singular, Vayichan Sham Yisrael, and Israel encamped, and it uses the Hebrew word that denotes as if it was one individual, because then they were united, Ki'ish Echad, Belev Echad. They were like one person with one heart. They were all in agreement. And that never happened again, but that will happen again in the Messianic age. And that's what we say, gather us, but together from the four corners of the earth to our land. Why four corners of the earth? The earth doesn't have corners, but it's an expression. In those days, the rabbis who composed this knew that the world was round. Talmud mentions it very clearly that the earth is round. But four corners means from all different extreme and disparate viewpoints. North, south, east, and west represent different ways of looking at things. Just like today we have right and left politically. Well, in Judaism, there can also be right, left, north, and south. They have different ways of looking at things, different attributes. So we want God to gather us from all those different viewpoints, all those different attributes, bring us together and unite us. And how does redemption occur? There are many things we can do to hasten the redemption. One of the things it says in the Midrash is that when we study Mishnah, that unites us, and that will bring the ingathering of the redemption. Why is Mishnah? Because Mishnah represents the laws of the Torah. When we study the analysis of the laws, when we study philosophy, everyone has a different level of understanding. But when we talk about the simple laws of the Torah, everyone is equal. Everyone has the same understanding and the same way of relating to a law. That really unites us. And the Rebbe instituted a study of Maimonides' Mishnah Torah, which is the updated codification of Jewish law. And by Jews studying that is what unifies everyone, and that hastens the redemption. And we conclude with, blessed are you, God, who gathers in the dispersed exile of his people Israel. God is the one who gathers in the dispersed exile of his people Israel. That reinforces what was said right before this. It's not a political process. The political process is great if it helps the Jewish people. We always need Jews to be involved politically to make things better. But when we talk about the future redemption, it is God's redemptive process. Without going into the different viewpoints about Zionism within the framework of Torah, one thing is clear, that nobody who believes in the Torah believes that a political process could be the salvation for the Jewish people. Because after almost 66 years of the existence of the state of Israel, Israel still has the same number of enemies and more, the same existential threats to its existence, the same divisions, and everything that punctuated Israel's genesis is still there today. Political processes are great, but they are not the solution. They are not the panacea. We need a divine intervention to make the ultimate transition from exile to redemption. No matter how a person believes in and loves Israel the way it is today, it's certainly not what we talk about when we say redemption. Redemption means that God, through Mashiach, brings in a spiritual revival that changes the world. And that can happen overnight. Finally, we spoke about, when we did the first 6 personal blessings, how they parallel the second 6. But let's go backwards now and do it again, but in reverse. The first communal request is for God to sound the shofar and to bring about the reunification of the Jewish people. which is the ultimate goal in redemption. But what was the first personal request? We're asking God for das, for knowledge. As I mentioned before, what is the idea of reunification on a micro level? It's taking the different faculties of your soul and bringing them together, bringing harmony in your soul. I think one of the most pervasive emotional problems that people suffer from these days is rooted in the fact that we are not a coordinated being. Our faculties are all over the place. We're splintered, we're fragmented people. If we had harmony and all of our parts would be working together in harmony, we would be much better off emotionally as an individual. Well, the same thing is true as a people. We are disjointed, fragmented people. So we're not in good spiritual health. So this blessing, we're asking God, restore our spiritual unity, that where all of our parts are together. Well, what is the blessing, a request for das, for knowledge? What's the difference between das and the other faculties of intellect? Das is what links together the intellect and emotions, because the most common area of a breakdown of our systems is the breakdown, the bridge between the mind and the heart. That's the most serious breach in our lives. When our mind goes in one direction, we know what's right, but our heart takes us in another direction. And it's always a struggle to keep those two together. Between the brain and the heart, there's a narrow passage called the neck. Paro, who was the villain who kept the Jews enslaved, the word Paro, it says, if you rearrange the letters, it reads Ha'oref, the nape of the neck. He's the guy standing in between the mind and the heart. He doesn't let the message from the mind to go through to the heart. And then Chassidus goes into the butler of the king and the baker of the king, and how they are instrumental in preventing the mind from controlling the heart. So we have that blockage. That's one very general area where the faculties don't go together. What links the mind to the heart? The faculty of das. Das is not just understanding, it's connecting yourself to the idea, to the point where the idea penetrates and it affects your feelings and your emotions. So the request for das, for knowledge, parallels this request for unification of the Jewish people. That's the macro unification. Das is the micro unification. When you have the micro, then it contributes to the macro. When you have the macro, that will eventually change the individual as well. Any questions? When you leave the parking lot, there's a lot of traffic, so make sure that you...
Thank you.
It was a good evening. There's always so much. I mean, I'm sure if we try to go into more depth, we'd not be on this for weeks.
Mm-hmm. No questions. Very cool. Thank you.
Thank you.
This is the same cycle, the one we had before, right?
Yeah, we just
Continue.
left off. And instead of just stopping and waiting next year to pick it up, we decided to go through the whole Shemona Esrei.
Amazing.
So this is the 10th one, so we have another 9.
What?
What?
Yeah, we will finish.
So long?
We will finish before your next session.
Yeah, but it says Wednesday night, so it doesn't interfere.
It's not a contradiction. Yeah, so go on. And then after we finish one answer, we can start doing other prayers. Also.
Kaddish would be.
We can do the Kaddish, yeah. Sure. Actually, we skipped something in the Shemona Esrei.